Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is a true honor for me to present on behalf of the Embassy of Peru one of the most recognized Peruvian writers of her generation, Claudia Salazar Jiménez. It is also a pleasure to express the satisfaction of the Peruvian Embassy to participate as a sponsor of this great event. Claudia Salazar Jiménez, born in Lima, Peru, is a literacy critic, professor, cultural manager, and the founder of the literary journal Fuegos de Arena. Claudia studied literature at the University of San Marcos in Lima and holds a PhD in literature from the New York University. She edited the anthologies Escribir in Nueva York 2014 about Hispanic American narrators and Voces para Lilith 2011 on contemporary South American women writers. Claudia is also the founder and director of PERUFEST, the first Peruvian cinema festival in New York. His first novel, The Blood of the Aurora, won the International Nobel Prize for the Americas, which has been translated into English by Deep Volume. She also received the TUMI USA Award in 2015. Her most recent publication is the collection of short stories Coordenadas Temporales 2016 and the youth novel 1814 Year of Independence. Part of his work has also been translated into French, Portuguese, and German. She currently teaches at Brooklyn College in New York. Thank you very much.
Okay, hi everyone, good morning. I'm Natalie Kousaka. I am executive producer of audio at the Washington Post. I'm also an avid reader, so it is always just a complete and utter joy to come to the book festival every year, and even more so to have the privilege to interview one of the authors. Just to give you a lay of the land, I'll be speaking with Claudia for about 25 minutes, and we're very keen to take your questions after that, so please formulate them and have them ready. It is much more interesting and vibrant than hearing me ask all the questions the whole time. There are microphones over here and over here. Claudia will be signing her at 12:30 in the lower level, so you can go and find out more from her then. So let's get started.
Okay.
Welcome, Claudia.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for being here this morning.
So as I was just telling Claudia, for me, coming to this novel, I came with completely open eyes, open thoughts, because I really didn't know much about this period in Peru. There was a guerrilla movement in the 80s called the Shining Path. Some of you may have heard of it, some of you may not have, but it was a particularly brutal movement. 70,000 people or so died during that period. A period that was described as the time of fear. And I really wanted to start with hearing from you, what are your memories of that time? I mean, you were a child, but it was clearly something that pervaded life in Peru.
Thank you for the question, and actually have the first idea about the use of the word guerrilla, about the Shining Path. I think it's a terrorist group. So I think it's very important to start in defining terms. Right?
They define themselves as guerrillas.
They define actually themselves as a political party. Yeah, definitely.
Interesting.
And their actions were actually terrorism. So it's very, very important to define that, I think. And that time was the entire 80s in Peru, so I was a child there. And I actually, what I remembered the most is the fear. And I opened the novel with a scene when we have a blackout. Blackouts were very common in Peru during that time. I even remember the first time I was in Lima with my parents. I was around 4 or 5 years old. And then in the city, we were in the car with my parents, and there the entire city just blackout, the black. No? I remember the obscurity. And then this was very something that repeated a lot of times during the 80s and even at the beginning of the 90s. So it was always the idea that the shining path is, even if it is happening on the Andes, not in Lima, the capital, but in the Andes, there's always a fear that the shining path were at any point coming to Lima and they were going to kill us all. That was
So even at such a young age, you felt that visceral, my life is in danger.
My life, and my family's life, even you cannot actually verbalize that at that time, but you can see from your parents, from your family, your friends, something was going on there. And actually, I think by the mid of the 80s, we were allowed to watch more TV, and actually the Shining Path started being more brutal. So we have a constant of annihilations, a lot of people dying, a lot of destructions in the cities also, because the Shining Path were coming to Lima very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's interesting you talk about what you saw on TV, because one of the things I want to get to is one of your characters is a photojournalist, and she wants to go out to the countryside to really document
Yes.
what is happening there. How did they come about? I mean, what was their ideology that sort of moved them? The leader was a philosophy professor,
Yeah.
who decided that there needed to be a movement to support poor working people.
Yeah, and that brutal violence, right? That actually was one of my questions, because the Shining Path as a movement, if it is possible to use that word for that group, it's very difficult for me to try to find a precise word for that. And my main question, especially when I was working on this character, not a photojournalist, but the character is actually from Guerrilla, from the Shining Path. That was my question. How was that possible that these so educated people, specifically from the humanities, lot of them were philosophers, especially the women were social workers. This character is a social worker. How these people were so social conscious and they actually ending killing the most poor, the most innocent people in Peru? How? Why that happened? And trying to answer that was the part of the process of the construction of the novel. I don't know if one of the possible answer is they have a lot of ideology they even repeat that like a mantra, no? They are like a Leninism, Marxist ideology, but also they receive a lot of influence from the Cultural Revolution Mao's, from China. And they was trying to replicate that their Cultural Revolution in China, in Peru. The only problem was actually they were trying to, the communist ideology comes from the ideology of the proletarian, but actually in the Andes, we don't have proletarians, we have peasants. And that's one very important problem, because they try to impose that communist ideology in the social structures in the Andes. And they just cannot do that, because they found another reality. It's like when you have that important crash between ideology and reality. I didn't know how to manage it, and they just start killing people in order to force them.
And the peasants were the sort of innocent victims as a result, because they didn't understand what was going on, and it didn't.
What they were talking about.
It didn't speak to their life.
Yeah, absolutely. It's what is this ideology of the proletariat? But we are not that.
Yeah.
So what are you talking about?
So for those of you who haven't read the book yet, I recommend it. It looks like a novella almost. It packs a huge, huge punch. There are three characters whose experience we lived through during this period, and they're all women. And to me, that was one of the things that really stood out about this book, because I think it's fair to say that our knowledge and understanding of so many movements, from whichever side you're looking at, is mostly told through the eyes of men. And I wondered why you wanted to tell this story through the eyes of three very different women who represent different types, classes of people who were affected by it, and why telling that story through women and their experience was the device you decided to use.
Yeah, because precisely what you just said, the entire human history was told through the eyes of men. So I think the entire of our stories and history are they came from the men vision. So at this point in history, even in Peru, in the literary tradition, Peruvian literary tradition, always when you speak about war, when you speak about violence, it's always from the point of view from men. So we already know that's nothing new, right? So there are actually in Peru, there's a lot of novels and short stories about this period also. But always from the point of view from a soldier, from a general, from a politician, so from a guerrilla man, always. So my take was to introduce, to put the voice of women there. But I was thinking also, what is the meaning of this? What's the meaning of putting the voice of women in telling a story, right? I think it's not only just to use women characters, because we know sometimes even if you have a women character, doesn't imply that you have a feminine perspective. I think it's very important to make this distinction, right? And I think the feminine perspective has to do with we tell the stories that are not told yet. So you have to tell the story from the other perspective, which is usually the perspective of the margins, no? The other voices. And also, what was very important for me, assuming this feminine perspective, was try to tell this story from other characters, but also trying to break a language. Because usually when we tell the common stories about violence, there is always a kind of linear perspective, right? Because and also keeping that, at the same time you keep the logic of violence. My problem, when I was thinking on how to tell this, I was thinking, okay, if I am going to repeat, if I'm going to use the same rhetoric that we were using by the entire literary tradition, at what point I am only repeating that violence? So I was trying also to reconvene language to, at some point, to make language to do something different with this story. That's why the structure and the, you can say that about it.
Yeah,
The
structure and the sort of narrative devices you use there's a mix of them in the book, which I think also is something that contributes to how the narrative hits you as a reader, because there are many instances where it is sort of stream of consciousness about violence in a way that I would imagine one might experience that violence. One doesn't experience violence in perfectly formed sentences, sort of words and phrases. The thing that struck me about focusing on women, and in fact you reference this, the photojournalist in the book, she talks about the work that she's trying to do, what she wants to see when she goes out there, how she is encouraged by a television reporter whose words are censored, and he says the only way to show this is through pictures. And she talks about how these are photos that push you to look outside the frame, that gesture at all that hasn't been captured, how much is outside the frame, what stories will get away. And I feel that you can apply that to the stories of women, that those are the stories that get away. Those are the ones in the peripheral vision of anyone, whether you're government, whether you're military, whether you're journalism, especially in a warlike situation. Was that sort of an intentional way of using a journalist character in that way?
Absolutely, yes. When I tried to decide which kind of characters I want to use on the novel, this one was the first one, and actually in the first version, in the beginning, the starting version of the novel, she was just a journalist, not a photojournalist. But when I was developing the novel, I decided that I need her to think about images also, because of the idea of what is happening outside the frame, and I definitely decided. And also, returning to your former question, I decided to use three different characters, three different women, because I needed, when we talk about the female voices, there's not just one voice.
Right.
I think it's very important to decide that there's no one women voice, right? We have to use a very different perspective, a very, different perspective, not only because from the matter of gender, but also from origin and social class.
Right.
And that was very important for me to introduce also the peasant character, who was a very poor woman from the Andes, and also the guerrilla woman who's also from the middle class, but also very educated.
Yeah, I think that the class structures that are evident through these three women is really interesting. And, I think any of us who do not have this experience or have lived through a country going through this sort of sometimes think, what is it that makes somebody join a terrorist movement? And we often focus, well, particularly in the current climate we live in, young men. And usually we hear about young men who join a movement. Now, one of your characters, Marcela, she is a social worker and teacher. She is married, she has a daughter, she lives what might be considered a sort of relatively normal, good life. And she becomes a guerrilla with the Shining Path. And I'm just interested in how you examined that. It seems that the catalyst for her, she relies on the government for finances, for projects and the social work that she's doing. They lose some money for one project, and it seems to put her over the edge, and she decides it's time to go. But there is so much about her that is rebelling against the normal structures of being a woman and what's expected of women in society there. And those two things collide to turn her into a member of the Shining Path. And that was sort of unexpected to me. I expected to hear a sort of political disposition, not also a very sort of a mix of sort of gender challenges, which start from her as a child. She is brought up Catholic. She is a devout Catholic. She decides she wants to be a priest, and she is told she can't be a priest. Why not? Because she's a girl, which doesn't sit well with her. So that to me was sort of the roots of being a woman in this society can turn you into a guerrilla. Am I reading that wrong?
No, I mean,
you
never know what exactly can happen in anyone's head, right? Like, what is going on there? And as I told you at the beginning, that's why one of my main questions in the novel, what turns some very educated person, very irrational person in a kind of fanatic, right? Because these people were actually very, very fanaticism about that ideology. And actually, from the three characters, that was the most difficult for me, because I was trying to get into her, and I actually did a lot of research for that, and it was very difficult because in Lima there is there are two kind of archives in Lima. The first one was a lot of testimonies from the Truth Commission in Peru, from the people in the Andes.
Peru did have.
Yeah, we have a Truth Commission there about those.
After this period, which I thought was interesting too.
Yeah, there's a kind of 16,000 testimonies. I read some, not all of them, possible, but I was reading specifically the testimonies on sexual violence. Mm-hmm. So just to get an idea of what happened to women during that time, and also to get an idea of the ambience in the Andes. Definitely was more brutal than in the capital, right? But to get to know more about the terrorists was kind of difficult, because there is a part of the archives that actually they don't want you to get access to that. And it's very kind of dangerous to get access to that. If you get some access there, you can be accused of trying to making an apology? No, an apology for terrorism, an advocate from terrorism. So you became a kind of suspect for that. Even so, I tried to get access to that, and at the end, I got access to two testimonies of the main character, the main actually main leaders of the Shining Path. And one of them is a woman. And that character, Marcela, I was very based on that character. Her name is Elena Iparraguirre. He was actually the number 2 of the entire structure. And what's very shocking for me was actually the religious background for her. And it looks like from that idea of a very fanatic religious structure,
Right.
was a very not like a very strange break from that, but actually think kind of a continuation of that kind of thinking.
Right, that's what struck me, that she was a very religious person. She was failed by her religion and found another thing to believe in,
Yes,
in a way.
was something to put their faith on.
Exactly.
Their faith and their strength, right?
Yeah, and what's interesting, she's seduced by them.
Yeah, by
in a way
him,
that
by the leader.
By the leader,
Also, yeah.
and you know, she really thinks about her lot as a woman, which clearly the seeds of that were in her early sort of disappointment with Catholicism. But even on her wedding night, I don't think for most women this would lead to joining a terrorist movement. Let me just say this at the front end. But you're right, and this is her thinking. On her wedding night, there would come children, a house, a kitchen, work too, diapers, plates, kitchen, dress, makeup, over and over and on, evermore. Having a husband and daughter was holding me back from the revolution. Now it was time for my body to be trained, for my body to be disciplined, to transform into a revolutionary weapon. Tougher, more warlike, none of this husband, kitchen, children. I will state for the record, I've never had any desire to join such a group, but this passage really spoke to me. I love my husband, I love my children. But I think that is what makes her somewhat contemporary. And this was in the 80s in Peru, a place I don't know much about, but I think that sort of consciousness of a female. Were there a lot of women in the Shining Path?
Actually, yes. And actually, I think one of the reasons, because the Shining Path was so kind of popular between middle-class women at that time, was because the Shining Path allows a lot of women to get into the higher levels of the party.
Huh.
That's why. And that's why very seductive in that. But and there's a lot of sociology studies about this, because kind of feminine, the introduction of women into the guerrilla, etc. But at the same time, I was thinking on that when I was writing the novel, and something very interesting became the idea of even if when you have women in that kind of a structure, that doesn't imply that the kind of institution is not patriarchy also.
Right.
Because even the Shining Path allow a lot of women get into the leadership. Actually, the structures became, and they still were very, very vertical, very patriarchal in that kind of view. And actually, I think from the 3 characters, actually Marcela probably is the one that keep the masculine voice,
yes,
even being a woman.
And I think she keeps that masculine voice because she's very involved in the upper end of the movement, and she does become involved violently with this movement.
It's a period of becoming part of the institution at the same time.
Yeah, exactly.
So you want to revolution that, but at the same time you're part of that. So no, just let's try to keep the hierarchies, right?
Yeah. I just want to alert people to think about their questions. I'm going to get to them in just a few minutes. I want to quickly go through the other 2 characters. The most sympathetic one I find is Modesta, a peasant woman who has a husband and children. Again, it's almost as if the Shining Path appears out of nowhere and completely upends her life in a way that she has no idea what to do, and realizes that she just has to kind of live through it. It's incredibly painful. And is she representative of how the people who supposedly the Shining Path were representing
We're helping.
helping
the revolution for them.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what it is.
Were just completely disconnected from what was going on.
And another problem during this period, but also that the poorest people in Peru doesn't suffering only from the violence came from the Shining Path,
But also from the army.
from the state.
Yeah.
Because the Peruvian state, they were trying to go against the Shining Path, but actually they don't know who they are.
Yeah.
They don't know how to do it. So sometimes they're just confusing. They were very confusing between the Shining Path and the peasants. So they wasn't sure about, okay, maybe you're a peasant, maybe you're the Shining Path also. Okay, just let's try to kill them all. That was the first step of the internal war in Peru. It was that because they, how we can kill a lot of them. Okay, maybe if we arrive to a village and maybe we kill 60, maybe 5 of them are actually from the Shining Path. But we are kind of start winning this.
Something we'd call collateral damage.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And they kind of feel allowed to do that because they don't feel that the peasants were kind of citizens, real citizens. They are Peruvian citizens, a kind of second-class citizens.
Right. And the class structure is interesting because the news photographer, she's a young woman in her 20s who lives in the city. She's white, I guess, would be
upper middle
way
class.
Upper middle class moves in circles where people are connected to the politically powerful, to the military. She has this sort of idealism of I'm going to go out and find out the real story, but she is not averse to using the connection she has in order to get out to tell that story. But in the milieu that she is in, the way you describe that class of people who are dismissive and,
frivolous.
Yeah.
Point, yeah.
And it's like this thing is happening over there and we don't really know much about it, but these are terrible people and they must be stopped, regardless of the damage. I don't know, you were probably too young to know people like that at the time, but were they based on some kind of people who actually, you might have encountered?
That was, this was, as I'm telling you, it was the kind of political perspective at the beginning of the war. The official vision of the conflict is very far away. It's not happening here. But we have to condemn them because maybe they are all savages. That was the idea. Not just the Shining Path, but also the peasants. You know what? They are not human at some point. That's why we have to contain them to avoid them. They came to Lima, right? That was the most important part of that. So at the beginning, yes, and even when the war was close to the ending, there was the idea of okay, we are in Lima, but there's a kind of bubble. You know, we are protected because we have money. We have no problem with that. Even when there was a lot of things happening in Lima, but in Lima, in the more peripheral districts on that. Yeah.
If anyone wants to move to the microphones, please do. As soon as I see someone, I will call upon you. The violence, I think we can't talk about this book without talking about the violence against these women. All 3 of the women are raped in this book. It's something we hear a lot about in war. And the way you describe it is you use almost exactly the same description for each one of those rapes. Somebody is raped by the military, somebody is raped by the Shining Path. I guess that's something that you couldn't not have, right? In telling this story? How much of that did we learn about in the Truth and Reconciliation sort of investigation? Like how did we come to know about that kind of violence against women?
Actually, that scene, I prefer to name it that scene, was one of the first scenes that just came up when I was still writing the novel. And then it was new that actually was a lot of rapes during this time, and was actually very well known that none of these rapes go through any kind of judgment, any kind of reparation. nothing happened. It's like the life for women just continued to be the same after this. So I think it was very important to think also not just what happened, what kind of violence we have during war, but how this violence against women across this kind of historical time, not just during war, but also how this violence against women is something that cross history, something that cross geographies.
Right.
That is always almost the same. I mean, I was reading also some testimonies from the civil war in, I don't remember the name, the Tutsis
In Rwanda, yeah.
In Rwanda,
Yeah.
yes. And I had the opportunity in New York to see, to watch a photographic exhibition about the women with their children
yes.
from rape. And each picture has alongside a brief testimony of the women. And I was reading that. As I was actually thinking, but it's the same. I mean, the pain is the same, even the words choice are the same. For me, it was like what kind of rhetoric of pain, rhetoric of rape at some point, is the same for every woman in the planet.
Right, and in these three women, whichever quote side they're on,
Yeah.
they all went through the same experience, which I think is heartbreaking and thought-provoking as well, because you could not have three more different women, three more different experiences, all of them who are victims.
Very different, but they became victims at the same time. And I decided to make to use the same scene, just making some very small changes, some words, actually to making this more like stronger. You know?
Right. No, it
and even
reinforces.
for some readers, just told me when they read the second rape, they think it's a kind of mistake from the book. So they have to. But I read that before, right? So even that movement, I was thinking on that. That even the reader think on that was kind of mistake.
Yeah.
Like shouldn't be repeating that. Why? And when they get to the third one, no, it shouldn't be done. But yes, maybe. What kind of difference?
I think it reinforces the horror. We have a question over here.
No, I don't really have a question, but I have a comment. I've had a number of Latin American friends. They're all upper middle class. One in particular was a Venezuelan, and he lived in a lovely house, drove a Mercedes, had a job, professor at the university. They had a maid, and yet he was a communist. And I've always wondered, do they not understand what communism is? And what's the thinking behind that? That's it.
I think everyone should answer their own their own ideology position. But there's one thing is very important. One thing that's very important to distinguish, right? Even I said the Shining Path recognized themselves as a political party. They even said the Communist Peruvian Political Party. That wasn't their real name, right? They were actually a party. And a problem for the left in Peru was actually the Shining Path. Because after that, my entire generation was, okay, if they were communists, and the communists kind of, they are assessing, right? But there is the idea, what happened during the 90s was another thing, but you got the fear that being from the left implies being a terrorist.
Right.
Which actually isn't true, right? We already know that. I mean, we know that communism ideology isn't terrorism, something very different. But in Peru during the 80s, I mean, as a child, we got that idea. And actually during the 90s, definitely you learn a lot, you go to university, and it's very different. But I think for the right in Peru was very essential, this, because we have a generation apolitical, thinking no political, taking a lot of distance from politics thinking. But at the end, you have to distinguish this. I mean, the left doesn't imply being a terrorist, right? But it was very difficult for us as a generation to distinguish that because of the Shining Path.
Another question over here.
So you mentioned that you went through the archives and did a lot of research, reading testimonies especially. Curious if there was an angle in particular that you wanted to take on in the book, but you missed out and you keep thinking about it? And maybe also, what other books should we read? Like as a Peruvian, I haven't read a lot of history books, but I really want to start engaging in that. So I'd love recommendations.
Okay, thank you for the question. When I was writing a novel, for me it was very difficult to try to to define one point of view. I mean, my only point of view was trying to catch the feminine perspective, right? And saying that, I didn't want to impose any perspective from the Peruvian state or even from the Shining Path. And I love that because a lot of readers told me very different reactions to the novel. One of them just told me, I really love your novel because, it's very ideological, distant. Doesn't take any ideological side. Oh, perfect, thank you. Another person told me, I love your novel because, it's very against terrorism. Okay, thank you. Like, another person was one journalist here, not here in DC, but in New York. He was making me an interview, and before the interview, he told me, may I make you a question before starting, just off the record? I mean, okay, just do it. Do you have any affiliation to the Shining Path? What? Okay, no. On the record, no. Yeah, because you have one character that is a terrorist. Yeah, but it's fiction, right? That's the freedom of fiction also, and I don't think it's kind of very reductive to say if you have one character that is from the party, so it's very reductive, right? And another person, and I know this he was an academic, and I know he had some affiliations with some people from the Shining Path. Once he told me, I really like your novel, but I think it's very reactionary. So he and that word, right, reactionary, was a word used very commonly by the Shining Path to design everything that wasn't there from their ideology.
Well, I think that range of reactions shows you got it right.
For me, it was yes. Terrorists, no ideologically purity.
Exactly. So any reading recommendations?
The reading recommendations, yeah. There's one by Gonzalo Portocarrero, took the name. And then there's another one by Gustavo Gorriti. They are kind of very kind of introduction to the Shining Path ideology. And definitely if you can have access, because it's online, the report from the Truth Commission. It's like nine very big books, but then you have not entirely the testimonies, but you have a kind of a rationale of what happened. Yeah, and we just celebrated the 16 years, like a couple of days ago, of the publishing of the report. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I've got two questions over there. Those are the two I'm going to take, so we can have enough time. Oh, three, if you make them quick. Okay, sir, you first.
Thank you for being here. I'm Peruvian. I left Peru in '97. So I've read a lot of the work that comes out from writers from that period, including Jose Carlos Agüero, and then you have all the people that left Peru in the '80s, like Mazzotti, etc. But my question is, not a lot of people understand that the repercussions of this time period of Peru have created sort of like a cultural, almost near war, which is tearing the country apart even to this day, politically speaking. And there's sort of a battle for memory also ongoing in this country for Peruvian Americans, being told perspectives from the right or from the left, and these beliefs that start dividing people. So what do you think the role of a cultural artifact like a book as yours is, or do you see it mostly as art first, before as a artifact of memory?
I don't think it's possible to make that kind of divorce between art and politics. I think art is always political. Art is always, in this case, a work of a task of memory also. And I think the main objective, it is possible to say about writing in general, is to make people think about that. It's not to be complacent about what happened. Try to be to introduce all the possible perspective, and also try to what happened with the examples I just gave you, right? Just to open the writing space to the readers, so the readers can put themselves into it also. That's why I think my novel gets these two so different reactions, because every reader, each reader was putting themselves onto that. And I think definitely if I just got some, just one perspective, one reaction, I think I would fail as a writer. I think any writer should be open to that. And even from people from different ideologies, right? I think that.
Okay, we've got 2 questions, if we can make them brief.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Yes, I have a question, something that surprised me when you said that during the research that you did in the library, you find some documents that couldn't be read, that is kind of like forbidden. Don't you think that this is kind of like a censorship? And the second part of the question is, given that you couldn't reach those documents, did you have the opportunity to talk to real women that passed through that time in different, positions, like the peasants of the guerrilla or the middle or high class in the city?
So about the research, I can understand at some point why the Peruvian state was trying to confine this document. They weren't so prohibited. They just make you pass like a tough process to get it in. I just got to that archive. I was trying to invent some things to get access to that, yeah, I'm kind of research, blah, blah, blah. And actually, it's not so prohibited, but they have a kind of very eerie aura. They start, this is from the Shining Path, this is from the terror time. I thought it was almost the same fear during that time from that archive, because it wasn't only documents, it was kind of memorabilia also, objects, stuff, photographs, a lot of pictures, images. Was kind of a very eerie place to go. But actually, when I got access to that, even the people from the library were very kind. After you pass that kind of veil at the beginning, but I can understand why that kind of resistance to that. The final report was just presented like a couple of years before that, and there was a kind of tension in the Peruvian community for that. Yeah.
It's a challenge for a lot of places to relive that history. Okay, last question over here.
All right, thanks so much. You mentioned the one perspective you did want to capture was the feminist perspective, and there were a couple of things that were highlighted. Feminine?
Feminine.
Yeah. But there are several things that were highlighted that make it seem almost universal, or at least more broadly tangible, which makes it all the more powerful. But I'm wondering if there are any things that you would highlight as uniquely Peruvian feminine perspective.
I'm very troubled with that notion of uniqueness in relation to national identity. So yeah, I must, if some kind of thing about the uniqueness, if it is possible to say that, I'm forcing this idea because you were asking. No, thinking specifically on that historical context, right? Because I think, that the perspective of the novel is a more universal thing of the violence against women is very, universal. But specifically in this time in Peru, I think it's more related to the to this division, between to this kind of different citizens in one country. Mm-hmm. Not so specifically Peruvian, right? Because everything in almost any country, even here now, it's more evident that we have like first-class citizens and second-class citizens, and some people that are not considered citizens at all, not even considered humans at all. That's why I think it's very difficult to talk about something very unique and Peruvian. But I think, yes, that kind of division between who's human and who isn't, something that is very not Peruvian but very universal also. I arrived to that again. Thank you for the question. Yeah.
It's a really remarkably powerful book, and I learned a tremendous amount from it. And Claudia, I wanted to thank you for the conversation.
Thank you everyone for being here.